Hi, welcome back to my channel. Today I want to make a video talking about why I think it's worth learning Tagalog. Despite what lots of people think, which is that if you're a foreigner in the Philippines, you really don't need to bother learning the language. The thing is, it's often Filipinos that think that foreigners don't need to learn Tagalog. So this video isn't just aimed for foreigners to try and get you to learn the language. This is also for Filipino people to just educate you about how relevant your language is and should be, so you can encourage your foreign friends to learn Tagalog, because I'm really tired now of being one of the only non-Filipinos that has learnt this language. The first reason we're going to be looking at why you should learn Tagalog is there's a surprisingly high amount of Tagalog speakers. Whenever people think of big languages with lots of speakers, Filipino doesn't normally come into mind. If you Google the amount of Tagalog speakers, often it will underestimate the amount there actually are. According to Babbel, there are 40 million Tagalog speakers, which is still more than languages like Dutch and Thai, but this must still be underestimating the amount, and maybe it's only taking into account native Tagalog speakers or people who speak Tagalog as their first language. The fact is, nearly all Filipinos in the Philippines know how to speak Tagalog, and the Philippines has a population of over 110 million people. The only people really in the Philippines that wouldn't know how to speak Tagalog would be people in rural areas in the provinces, often in places like Mindanao. But even in Mindanao, nearly everyone there knows how to speak Tagalog. On top of this, there's over 10 million Filipinos living overseas. Many of these people as well know how to speak Tagalog. So, long story short, even though there's only 40 million recognised Tagalog speakers, in reality there's a lot more. In fact, easily over 100 million Tagalog speakers, which is a lot more than really well-known languages like Turkish, Italian and Polish. Tagalog is a big language with a lot of speakers, despite the Philippines not always being the most well-represented country in the world. You'll be surprised at just how big it is and how many people there are and how big their language is. The next two reasons why you should learn Tagalog is that not all Filipinos are fluent in English, and that Filipino language based off Tagalog is the main lingua franca in the Philippines. We're going to be looking at these next 2 points together just to debunk one of the myths that makes people think that it's not worth foreigners in the Philippines learning Tagalog, when I think it really should be. People think that because Filipinos speak English and that Filipinos can all communicate with each other in English, it's not worth foreigners learning Tagalog. But this isn't completely true, because despite Filipinos all having to learn English at school because it's mandatory for Filipinos to learn English at school, not all Filipinos are completely fluent in English, and even those that aren't always comfortable speaking in English and will often speak Tagalog instead because it's more instinctive for them to speak their first language. I know all this from personal experience. I'm not saying this to imply that Filipinos are bad at English, because they're not at all. But there are lots of Filipinos that can't really speak English fluently, and they're just more comfortable speaking in Tagalog. It's also worth knowing that standard Filipino based off Tagalog is the main lingua franca inside of the Philippines. It's what Filipinos use to communicate with each other if they're from different parts of the Philippines. Filipino and Tagalog are technically the same language. There's no real difference between them apart from the name. Some Filipinos have a different interpretation of which one is which. Some say there's no difference at all between them. Others will say that there is a slight difference because Filipino has more loanwords in it. For example, in Tagalog, bukaw means blue, and then in Filipino, azul means blue. But then other Filipinos would say there's no real difference at all, and you're just as right if you say azul is Tagalog. So if you are a foreigner, it's not worth getting muddled up between the two, because there isn't any real distinct difference between them. It's just the fact that officially the language in the Philippines is Filipino language, but then that is just based off Tagalog. Going back to the point I'm trying to make, Filipino is a language that all Filipinos will be using to communicate with each other. So if you want to understand what people are saying, it's definitely worth learning it. This happened to me lots of times before I knew Tagalog. Whenever I was with groups of Filipinos, they would speak to me in English, but then whenever they were speaking to each other, they were talking to each other in Tagalog because that's what they're comfortable speaking to each other in. It's not that they're being rude, it's just that's their language that they like speaking to each other in, and it's just easier for them. As an English-speaking foreigner in the Philippines, you shouldn't expect everyone to just adapt to your language and not only speak that to you, but also speak that to each other whenever they're around you, just because your language is bigger and you're from a first world country. Actually, it's a lot better if you adapt to their language and just try and learn a bit so you can understand what they're saying when they're talking to each other in Tagalog. Even if people are speaking in Taglish to each other, you still won't be able to understand them if you don't know any Tagalog, because Taglish is mainly still Tagalog, but just with the key words in the sentence being in English. However, often those English words will have Filipino affixes attached to them, and it will always be in a Filipino grammatical format, making it impossible to understand Taglish if you don't know Tagalog. So because of these two reasons, with not all Filipinos being fluent in English and the fact that Filipinos communicate to each other in Tagalog, it really is worth knowing Tagalog, even if you're not a Filipino. If you plan to spend a lot of time in the Philippines, you really should learn a bit of the language. The next point we're going to be looking at is that if you know Tagalog, it makes it easier to learn other languages such as Spanish. If you learn a language to what you already know, that automatically makes it easier to learn any other language. But it's even easier to learn another language if whatever you've learned has similarities to other languages too, if that makes sense. In terms of Tagalog, it has a lot of similarities with the Malay languages, especially with Indonesian. And then it has similarities in terms of the vocabulary with Spanish. Spanish being one of the most useful languages in the world to know. Anywhere between 15 all the way up to 40% of the words in Tagalog are derived from Spanish. Even a lot of Filipinos don't realise how many words there are. There's around 5,000 words in Tagalog that are from Spanish originally. Often these words do have a different spelling and pronunciation to what they would in Spanish. Sometimes even the meaning is different as well. For example, with siempre in Tagalog, that means of course, but then siempre, which is pronounced slightly differently in Spanish, means always. Even if all these words aren't the exact same in Tagalog and Spanish, you should easily be able to pick them up if you know Tagalog and then you tried learning Spanish. It's not just Spanish as well, there's a lot of similar Latin languages too, like Italian and even some Portuguese words that shouldn't be too hard to pick up if you know Tagalog. I already mentioned earlier that the Malay languages are very similar to Tagalog, and of course there's over 100 other Filipino languages that aren't too difficult at all to learn if you already know how to speak Tagalog. The next reason to learn Tagalog is to get closer to Filipino people and Filipino culture as well. If you really want to connect with Filipinos, you should at least make a bit of effort to learn their language. At first it might seem really difficult to learn Tagalog, especially if you're not used to learning languages. Often people that haven't really learned a second language before will just say, I'm not very good at learning languages, but then how can you know if you haven't really tried properly? It will really bless Filipinos. Even if you only know a bit of Tagalog, Filipinos will be really impressed with you, and I'm sure you'll have a much better experience and make more friends in the Philippines if you know how to speak the language. There's that famous saying that it's more fun in the Philippines, and I'd like to add to that it's even more fun in the Philippines if you know how to speak Tagalog. Filipinos will definitely feel more loved if you've gone through the effort to learn their language, which I think is a really valid reason to learn Tagalog. The next reason to learn Tagalog isn't necessarily the most important, but I thought it was still worth mentioning anyway, and that's to impress people. Now this really shouldn't be a reason why you learn a language, but I did think this was worth mentioning because this is something that I've noticed from my personal experience. And that is, if you speak a common, well-known language, especially any of the big European languages like Spanish, French, Portuguese, German, even Italian, people don't seem to care that much. But then if they find out that you know Tagalog, even if that's the only other language you know apart from English, people will be really impressed and they seem to think you're some kind of linguistic genius. The last reason we're going to be looking at why you should learn Tagalog is the most important in my opinion, and that's if you have a Filipino partner. This point is obviously relevant for all languages, but the thing is, lots of couples from different nationalities are usually happy just communicating with each other in English as a universal language, when it should actually be a lot nicer if couples learn each other's native language. It's so common for Filipinos to be with other nationalities. Nearly all the time it's always the Filipinos that have to learn the language of their partner, and hardly ever the other way around. Even if you're not a Filipino and you never plan to live in the Philippines, as long as you have a Filipino partner, it's still worth learning the language just so you can understand your partner whenever they're talking to their friends and family, and also so there's less of a language barrier between you, which can always be difficult in a relationship. Thanks for watching this video and for listening to all these points. Those were 7 hopefully convincing reasons why it's worth learning Tagalog, even if you're not a Filipino. Let me know in the comment section down below if there's any more reasons you can think of why it's worth learning Tagalog. Please give this video a like if you enjoyed it and or found it informative. Don't forget to subscribe as well if you haven't already. I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.